let's talk about managers for a second, because companies are full of managers and they have a large impact on employee productivity and satisfaction and all of that. How can managers create an environment that allows employees to thrive?
Yeah, I think it's getting harder and harder to be a manager. Certainly the last couple of years have been pretty tricky with some of the things that we've talked about. You add into that, things like the idea of it being not only a multi-generational workforce, but potentially a workforce with more generations than have ever existed in any particular workforce. And there's differences, between those generations that seem to be more significant than they ever were before. In our environment, our customer obsession is inviting a lot of customer demand, which we absolutely love. So it's not easy being a manager. First of all, I'd say it's not for the faint of heart. Sometimes organizations just make managers out of their best individual contributors, and I encourage teams to think very, very critically about that, because it is a different job, it's a different role, and there's a lot more that needs to be at play. But the number one thing that I encourage managers to do is be curious, and be especially curious about the employees that they are being asked to lead. All of us should set personal boundaries around the things that we share about ourselves. But for the individuals that are working remote, what we noticed during the pandemic is we got into each other's lives in a lot more ways than we ever did before. I didn't know you had a cat. I didn't know the lawn, you mowed the lawn on Thursdays. So we learned a lot more about each other, and I think that was good. And I think managers should continue to do that. What are the hopes and dreams of all the people on their team? What do they think they're good at, and what do they think their opportunities are going to be? What are the things that inspire them, that motivate them? I think to the degree that managers can really ratchet up that curiosity, it unlocks the natural empathy that I think all humans have for each other. And if managers can apply that insight and that empathy to their teams, I think they're just going to be more effective. I think another idea that I think about quite a bit comes from a mistake that I made earlier in my career. Early in my career, I had the idea when I became a manager that if I were just to manage everyone the way that I wanted to be managed, that I'd be off to the races. Turned out to be incorrect. And I see this still taught in different sort of manager courses. Great managers manage people the way that each individual wants to be managed, or the way each individual needs to be managed for them to be the best that they can possibly be. And so you have to be a chameleon as a manager. The way you work with this person on your team might be different than the way you work with that person on your team. Having the awareness to do that, having the agility to do that, I think can be very key. So be curious, be a chameleon, be very intentional about how you're engaging with your teams. I think if you do those things, you're off to a really, really good start.
Wow, that's a great list of points there. And one you kind of glossed over that I just want to reiterate because it was so important. Your best engineer is not necessarily going to be your best manager. You might actually be losing a great engineer and gaining a poor manager. So it's a completely different skill set. Now, a lot of times they can adjust. Smart people tend to be able to do that. But it's really, I fell into that trap many times as a new manager, promoting the wrong people. And that empathy. I mean, from an engineering standpoint, it's really like engineering. If you think about people as an engineering problem,
that's right.
It could work, right? And I think that's kind of what a lot of engineers do. But really kind of developing that empathy is so key.
Look, I think people were just complex systems, right? And I think applying that engineering mindset is just how do I learn about the system? How do I understand what drives the system as best I possibly can? And to the degree that I have the curiosity and the courage to do that, then I can optimize the relationship.
Absolutely. So as leaders, how can we kind of gauge the success? Say leaders are listening to this and they say, well, I want to work on my culture. One of the things that's, I think, most difficult is how do you measure success when it comes to culture?
Yeah, it's very interesting. Maybe you start in a small startup where you're a startup of 8 people. And if you're the leader of that startup and you kind of want to know what's going on in your organization, you kind of just walk out and you kind of have it, right? You're part of the system and you understand it. If you're a part of a larger organization, something that's scaled, one of the phenomenon that we sometimes look at is what is the distance that a leader has from their perspective to the perspective of most of the people in their organization. And you can measure distance in all sorts of dimensions, geographic distance, organization distance, time, age, culture. There's a lot of ways you can think about the notion of how far is a leader from the sentiment or what's most important for their organization. The one thing that I believe very strongly in, and for us, again, it's kind of a version of customer obsession, is as a leader, you've got to get to the front line. And whenever the front line is in your organization, you've got to get there, you've got to spend time. You have to have the conversations, you have to listen to the stories and the anecdotes. You have to be willing to learn. And if every time you go to the front line, you think it's an opportunity to give a speech, you might want to remember, 2 ears, 1 mouth. When you go to the front lines, the most important thing to do is listen, ask questions, and try to get as much information as you possibly can. For organizations like ours, we build mechanisms. And one of the mechanisms we have is we call it a listening system, which in a non-creepy way, in a non-sort of like overreaching sort of way, we try to make sure that our leaders are as connected to what's top of mind for our builders as we possibly can. In one of our mechanisms, we ask one of my favorite questions, which is, today, what is the most important thing for your leader to know? And it's incredibly rich, what our builders tell us that they think is top of mind for them, that they want their leaders to know about. And I think that's incredibly important just to get into the understanding of what is the employee sentiment. But the number one way that I think about measuring culture is I ask our customers, how did you experience our team? Tell me something that was critical going on in your business, and how did our team show up? What was the decision that you were trying to make about AWS, and how did you make that decision? And I even enjoy facilitating that storytelling from our customers. They'll tell us about critical technology decisions or expansion plans that they had, some work they're doing around cost. And I'll say, how did this person in AWS show up? What were they talking about? Because whatever our customers tell us they experience about us is the truth of our culture. Right? Because if the culture is the biggest manifestation of who you are, how your customers experience it is the number one thing that we need to understand.